We'll intervene whenever we decide it's in our national security interest to intervene. And if you don't like it, lump it.
The problem with America is not that we go around marauding around the world imposing ourselves. The problem with America in the last 10, 15 years since the end of the Cold War, really in the last 60 years, is that we've been too slow to get involved.
I don't know how many Iraqi civilians were killed, but I can assure you that the number is the absolute minimal that it's possible in modern warfare.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You know, that land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Welcome to the darkened hour.
Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour. I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald, and with me today are two very special guests, Ben and Erik, and they wish to remain anonymous for good reasons. I mean, the topic of 9/11 is basically a very taboo subject in many respects, and it still is even after 21 years, unfortunately. It does tend to bring out a lot of emotions in people. But Ben and Erik are here. They are from the podcast for the New American Century. It's a funny story, actually. As I was on viral media, I think it was Twitter, I had run into them by accident, and I loved the actual podcast name. And I said, wow, a podcast named after the Project for New American Century. I said, that's pretty crafty. And then when I looked at their episodes, I remember being very impressed, overly impressed, and that's something I'm not, that's something that's not visited upon me very much. I'm used to dealing with the very questionable fringe types. But these two young men won me over with their learned information regarding pre-intelligence into 9/11. And it just so happened that they knew who I was. And I'm very humbled to have them on the show and to introduce them to them as Ben and Erik from Podcast for the New American Century. Guys, pleasure to have you both on.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us, Adam.
I gotta right off the bat, just kind of pull the curtain back a little bit and let you know, Adam, that I've been playing the long game actually for almost 2 years now. This whole thing was started so I could come on this show. As of today, I'm at the podium with the Marines. Mission accomplished, ladies and gentlemen. We got them. So
we got them.
Truly is all ours. Thank you so much for having us. Honor and a pleasure. No, seriously, we started this show because there was not enough material like yours. So it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, genuinely. And the show has kept afloat with much of your encouragement. We were we were in a bit of a slump, kind of dormant, until we all of a sudden got a DM on Twitter from you encouraging us to continue the show and put out more episodes. And I remember when I saw your first message to us, I immediately screamed and sent a message to Ben. And I was like, you have to look at this. Adam DM'd us. He found us.
It's truly full circle, even though I think on maybe the first or second episode, Erik does shit talk you about, I think, the Soviet-Afghan war or something like that. But other...
I just
I
get
think I
into the
remember at one
semantics
point being
there,
like, oh shit,
I'm
he's going to find that and disinvite himself from the show now. Damn.
Yeah, I think you were just 3 episodes in, or 4
I think
episodes.
so, yeah.
And I remember you having a lull. And my message to you was like, why did you stop?
Yeah, Elden Ring came out as the answer.
I just said, why did you guys stop? And I was so interested in, to hearing why maybe you had, new life trends or something, jobs or something. I don't know. It could have been anything. But when you messaged back and you basically said, well, certain things got in the way, but maybe we'll have, some more time in the future. And sure enough, you're now 19 episodes in since that date in December of last year.
Episode 20 hopefully coming out this weekend, inshallah.
Inshallah, indeed. Funny thing is that now you guys seem to be on a roll, so to speak, and your episodes have just gotten better and better. And I'm so impressed with you.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, more so than most people. I mean, it's unfortunate I have to say this, even 21 years later, that we don't have this type of conversation with even just a general consensus of the audience. It's very rare that I get even young men such as yourself to talk about these issues, which are barely ever talked about, even with the experts. I believe me when I tell you, I'm very impressed with the both of you, and I
Thank
really
you.
thank you very much for doing it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And I figure, I'll start it off like that because, I could talk to you about just about anything, it seems. And, why don't I just start from the simple beginnings?
Sure.
Why September 11th, 2001 is such a depressing subject. It's such a expansive subject. And yet you chose this subject as a personal inquiry of yours, a personal interest. And I want to hear from both of you about why this subject.
Eric, do you want to go first on that? And then I can kind of wrap up with how we started the show as well.
Yeah. So Ben and I met. I mean, we met online, and we were both very interested in parapolitical topics. And I think Ben knew a lot more than I did at that point when we were first, talking and just reading stuff, listening to a lot of things. Honestly, entertaining a bunch of silly theories, even about 9/11 at the time, just out of ignorance. And for me, it was I realized how little I knew. We were both rather young when 9/11 actually happened, and it was kind of encountering my own ignorance surrounding the topic and wanting to know more and do better, and just slowly starting to read. And then the more you read, the more you realize that the more you read, the more you realize that you don't really know anything at all. And so it was just kind of this rabbit hole that I kept chasing, and I kept encountering things that would disprove things that I previously thought were true or real. And so I wanted to find out more about what I thought was correct that could be wrong, and vice versa. And just really something that there's just like you said, there's so much there, that there's so much to read that it just kind of seems endless. And it was never anything that I felt satiated by reading a single book. I just always wanted to find out more and learn more.
And for me, I was always kind of a sicko for this stuff growing up. From a very young age, I was that kind of nerdy kid that was always into military stuff, and was obsessed with Tom Clancy books and Metal Gear Solid, and was never really a big 9/11 person, but was always fascinated, especially with sort of intelligence agencies and sort of more covert operations, sort of military intelligence kind of stuff. And what specifically got me sucked in with the 9/11 kind of thing was probably 2019, 2020, well after Trump had been elected. There were, I think for a lot of people in my age range, and Eric and I are both early 30s. I think after Trump got elected especially, there was definitely a lot more politicalization that happened with people in our general age bracket, millennials or so. And I think for a lot of people with our kind of sicko proclivities, we ended up drifting to this kind of parapolitical research and discussion as sort of a way to push back against the direction that the government was heading in at the time.
Sure.
And for me, what became fascinating about 9/11, I had always been kind of interested, and we talked about this with you on our show. I was always interested, growing up, from a debunking aspect. I love those smug popular science guys, doing the debunking about the way the towers fell and stuff like that. Because for me, it always kind of felt you're just having fun with sort of almost alternate history kind of fiction kind of stuff. You're entertaining these wild ideas, and then you're putting them up against scientific quote unquote rigor. But there was never anything to me that seemed serious. And for me, that's what would have been appealing, because I also, at way too young of an age, a lot of, I think, people in our cohort saw Oliver Stone's JFK, and that was the first thing that had gotten me pilled on the CIA and the deep state, all the classic kind of conspiracy sort of stuff.
Yeah, we just all wanted to be Mr. X.
Of course. I mean, we all want to be a fast-talking Donald Sutherland. And, you know, I always wanted something like that out of 9/11, and, like, it always seemed like it was for cranks instead. Like,
right.
It was always the kind of poisoned well of, you know, missiles being shot at the Pentagon and thermite taking down Building 7 and that kind of stuff. But around, like, 2019, 2020, and you've had Ben Howard on your show before, he did a series with the podcast TrueAnon, where they got into at the time all of the different, it was a clearinghouse of 9/11 conspiracy content, and some of it I would say is not very good. I think some of it they would probably agree doesn't look great in hindsight, but there is plenty of it that first hit me to, like, the Alex Station, Richard Blee, the CIA FBI angle, which then led me to reading Disconnecting the Dots, Kevin Fenton's book, which we've basically just been doing a book report on for a year now, more or less, with some movie episodes. But that story, because they finally introduced me to an angle where it was things that made sense to me, because, like we've talked about with you on our show, like, we're not science guys. We don't fucking love science. You know, we don't know anything about controlled demolition or any of those kinds of arguments. But when you start talking about cables and memos being sent around between intelligence agencies, like, that's the one part of my brain where things start lighting up and making sense.
Right.
And, you know, we've started following that story. I was spending a lot of time in the lead up to the 20-year anniversary on History Commons, becoming just absolutely obsessed with the timeline. And what I did at first, just for kind of fun in one of our kind of history chats that we have, in probably the summer leading up to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I would take what I would find to be interesting entries from the given day that we were on and do like, on this day on the 9/11 timeline, like, this is what happened, this is what happened. And, you know, by August, we were getting into some of the things that were slightly more detailed. And there were a couple that I decided, instead of just, you know, copying and pasting things from History Commons, maybe I'll do an audio file and read something. And then that eventually turned into, well, why don't I try doing a podcast? Because I love this kind of stuff. And, like, I'd been very frustrated because I found your show. I plowed through the back catalog within a week and a half. And, you know, there's not a lot of other stuff. Like, you know, Nelson Martins has his great stuff, but that's more YouTube, and I'm more of a podcast guy. So it was eventually just, you know, being the change that you want to see in your podcast world. I was like, I'm going to just do this myself. And the thing about doing a solo podcast, Adam, my hat is off to you. And shouts out also to Michael S. Judge. We met, Erik and I, because we're also a big fan of his podcast, Death is Just Around the Corner, which is also a one-man show. I felt like I was going to lose my mind after doing about 10 minutes of that one time. So it quickly became a matter of finding a good co-host dynamic. Erik was more than up for the job, and we've been doing it ever since. I find that it's very helpful sometimes just having another person to bounce things off of, because this is it's a topic that is so sprawling and has so many different elements to it. I mean, we've basically been pulling at one yarn for this first year and a half now. Definitely not a season, but we've been kind of chasing this one leader, this one angle, and we still have just a mountain of things that we keep looking at each other and being like, well, maybe we'll get to that in 6 months.
Right.
But it's one of those things where it's just it's a bottomless hole. Even more so than I think other big, like, comparable geopolitical events, like, you know, the JFK assassination, for example, where, like, that also has a million tendrils. But with 9/11, it's the complexity, it's the fact that you have so many different countries involved that have histories that need to be covered. You know, you need to go back decades at a time sometimes. It's a never-ending well of content in a way, and it's more recent, so it doesn't have quite the same feeling of being just a black hole. I mean, since we've started the show, there have been some pretty dramatic, you know, revelations and documents that have been released around, like, Operation Encore, for example. So to us, I can't speak for Erik, but to myself at least, there's also definitely kind of more of a feeling that this is more recent history, and that the story might not quite be over yet, even though it feels more and more like ancient history at this point.
Right. I would definitely agree with that. I would also just add on, like, insofar as motivations for making the show, I have, like, I don't know, I feel very compelled to understand history by being able to explain it. So, like, if you're reading History Commons, it's one thing to just have a bunch of History Commons entries in a timeline, but being able to take that, concentrate it into a narrative that makes sense, that you can tell to somebody and they can understand what's going on, is something that really fascinates me, and it helps me better understand what's going on. And I think relating that to just kind of studying 9/11 and parapolitical happenings, and specifically geopolitics about 9/11 and pre-intelligence failures, I felt that I was starting to understand the world that we currently live in, which is very
Yes.
confusing, more because I was able to understand what happened in these events.
It's certainly different as you portray it to be. Like with 9/11 especially, it's a very depressing topic.
Yeah.
And very um, expansive in its nature. Actually, you bring up certain aspects of, say, foreign policy, which needs to be understood decades in the past,
Right.
as to why certain things happened and why certain things moved about in the ripple effects of 9/11, and then it starts to make sense. Um, you're much different in the way that I present 9/11 to people. I think,
Maybe a little bit, you could say
yeah,
that.
very much so. But this actually, I think, is a lot. I think it affects people better than in, say, how I go about doing a my pod. My podcast is much more darker, and it's much more stoic in its presentation. Well,
Yeah,
you
the
guys
intro music
actually,
really sets the tone there.
sure, but certainly you bring about a much more sociable attitude that reaches far more far bigger audience, a far broader audience that definitely needs to be touched on. And I think that's another benefit of your show, is that the both of you actually work so well with one another in telling a story, which is really hard to tell when you're laughing at the same time. Um, a coworker of mine, I talked to you about before we recorded. She knows what I do, but she says I can't listen to your shows because, you're too depressing to listen to. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. I can't. I'm not the. I used to be the very happy type, but learning about certain things has made me very demure, very
Right.
stoic in nature.
Yeah.
And we walk a fine line, we try to walk a fine line at least, because we try to not do the kind of true crime podcast sort of thing where at the end we end up kind of laughing at 3,000 people dying. Like, we try not to make a joke of what's actually happening, but
Right.
I think a lot of where the humor and a lot of the dynamic comes from is just a way of kind of processing how frustrating and exasperated we often are.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of the story, like when you do get into the details of who did what and who didn't do what, and like all of especially this petty bureaucratic backfighting between like the CIA and the FBI, like sometimes all you can do is laugh. But I think the other thing kind of that I wanted to comment on there, based off what you were just asking, I consider myself rather kind of like an early adopter as far as like the whole podcast thing went. Like, late 2000s, early 2010s, like I was already kind of like spending way too much of my time listening to other people because it's better than being alone with your own thoughts. And I find that podcasts like are a special kind of format because people throw around like the phrase friendship simulator and like similar kinds of things like that when they're talking about podcasts and why they're not good. But I think in a way, like, you spend an hour and a half listening to like two people talking back and forth in your head, every week. There is eventually like this kind of implicit trust that almost gets built up. If you're taking the time out to like, focus your attention on what these people have to say, then like obviously you're interested in what they have to say and you're open to what the message is. And I find that like that is a way that you can reach people. So that's why we try to be kind of like approachable and normal, because this is such a taboo, not only kind of a taboo topic, but it's such, like I mentioned earlier, such a poisoned well where like you have to, like, whenever I tell people in my day-to-day life that like I do something about 9/11, which is not, I try to avoid as much as I can, I always have to then immediately preface it with being like, well, it's not the kind of 9/11 thing you probably think it is. Like, this isn't Alex Jones.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Loose change. Like, it's
Right.
it's more of like the history leading up to. So, it's easy to scare people off, and we even though it's kind of a fine line to walk, I find that having sort of that kind of light balance to it, light touch to it, maybe, is a way to attract people in and like not freak people out.
Yeah.
Because again, it's such a poison well. I mean, I remember even reading Disconnecting the Dots the first time. The intro to that book is written because it's published by Trine Day, and I think the editor-in-chief at the time or someone high up at Trine Day like writes the intro, and like at one point like it quotes a few points from like an Alex Jones thing, and like I remember like wincing and being like, oh no, is this kind of book? And then like getting like a chapter and being like, oh no, it's not this kind of book. Like, this is the kind of stuff that I like. So yeah, I think it's all just about making it approachable and just having people not be immediately put off by what you want to say, because like if they're willing to listen, like there's a lot we can tell them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in regards to talking about this subject, have you ran into many people talk about the society itself? Have you ever come across people more often than not regarding how they see 9/11 in a fringe aspect of looking at it through the lens of an Alex Jones or through a Rebecca Raw type of deal? Or is it more than rare to come across somebody who knows who Paul Thompson is, for example?
It's definitely more rare to come across somebody who knows who Paul Thompson is.
I don't know anyone in my real life, no.
Yeah. I think if we're talking about encountering people in real life, friends, coworkers, acquaintances, I think more so I've encountered people who are mostly ignorant, don't really take seriously the Alex Jones angle, but are willing to hear what I have to say, as long as I'm willing to preface everything by saying I think Alex Jones is mostly like full of shit, and I'm like not really willing to like talk about that, and I'm more interested in talking about the history of like the way that I always frame it, and I think we both do, is we're not so much talking about conspiracy theory, we are talking about foreign policy decisions that led to 9/11 happening.
Exactly.
And when you put it that way, it's like, yeah, you look like a big nerd, but people are way more willing in real life to hear what you have to say. If you're like, oh no, I'm talking about stuff that like the Carter administration did. I'm talking about like the Trilateral Commission. I'm talking about all of these foreign policy issues that like Carter's NSA like helped make. That led to these things actually happening, and people always know that like, oh well, that like is definitely going to be based in truth and just like a very exhaustive analysis of the history of the topic, as opposed to, you know, I'm going to obsessively talk about where George H.W. Bush was on the morning of 9/11.
Golfing.
Where are you comfortable starting? Because 9/11 is, like I said, is such an expansive topic, and I've come across people that tell me, for example, like, where do you start? Do you start on the day itself, or do you start? And I always felt that if we go by the demographics, the age demographics of the person I'm talking to. So, in regards to a younger audience, I would start probably recent, and I would say 1979, because for me, that is where most of the 20th century players originate from, or basically many incidents happening in 1979, which basically saw a rise of Islamic fundamentalism and how the intelligence apparatus basically handled it, or mishandled it in most respects. And I said to myself, you know, how would I go about interviewing Ben and Erik in this podcast? And they said, well, you know, what's good about them is that I basically could go back to a certain period, even many years prior to that. But at the same time, I don't want to lose people in the audience by encompassing so many subjects.
No, I mean, first of all, Metal Gear Solid 5 came out years ago. Like, all the kids love the Soviet-Afghan war now because they've spent way too much time playing around in it. I think Operation Cyclone is fair game.
Yeah. And plus, even if you just like bring up, oh well, do you remember that like awful Tom Hanks movie, Charlie Wilson's War? They'll be like, oh, I think I heard of
one
that
of Mike
movie,
Nichols'
right?
last movies. What a bummer.
Yeah, I know, right?
I know.
But like, if you bring that up, then people will be like, oh, right, that's something that happened. Sure, okay. Yeah, they don't always connect it to like this like led to 9/11 happening, because the movie does a good job of whitewashing most of the actual events.
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks for reminding me to do an episode.
Is there a starting point for you when you talk to people who are generally ignorant about 9/11? Is there a certain point that you start from?
I would start from January of 2000 for the most part.
Yeah, not. I would say like the Al-Hazmi Almadar story, but
Yeah.
even more high level than the Al-Hazmi Almadar story. Like when I am on first dates, having to like very self-consciously explain like what it is I like to do. I always start with the Saudi involvement.
Yeah.
Like when people say like I don't say like, oh, I'm a 9/11 truther. Like I say like my interest is in the Saudi, the 28 pages in the Saudi involvement.
Yeah.
And you know, that is continually in the news. Like as soon as you tell them that President Brandon's been, you know, declassifying like this FBI information over the last, you know, year or so, like drip feeding the story out about Operation Encore, like people quickly start taking you seriously because like they can't really argue with that. But I mean, on top of that, I would say that the official story in general is what we tend to embrace instead of kind of push away. Like we tend to focus everything around what was in the 9/11 Commission, you know, what's in the other big reports like the DOJ IG report and the Senate Commission. So for us, like I would say that like it's all following the timelines of, you know, the terrorists themselves, like in, like Erik said, from January 2000 or so, like using that as a good starting point. And then from there, like every single player in the story has like another thread that you can then follow backwards because you know, if you want to talk about Al-Qaeda, well, then you have what 20, 40 years of Afghanistan history to tease back, and then Saudi history, at least back to the 1930s. Oh, and then, you know, you have to fold in Egypt from what the 40s onwards if, you know, if you're going to cover the Muslim Brotherhood effectively. So it's like everywhere that you want to look, like there's another place to start, and then it's just a matter of how far back you want to go on that timeline.
Yeah, but I think like
kind of leading to 9/11.
Yeah, but I think for me, what I've discovered in talking to people that really just don't know much, if you just kind of say like, okay, well, here's Al Qaeda, they get that. Al Qaeda was, you know, there were Al Qaeda operatives that were meeting to plan terrorism or terrorist attacks in 2000. When they came to the United States, the CIA found out about it, and they made moves to stop the FBI from finding out about it. That's a great starting point, and most people, if they're interested, will want to know more about the back history. But if you're trying to convince somebody that they should, you know, learn more about pre-intelligence failures on 9/11, I don't think that a lot of the people who don't know much about it need much more back history. And the more that you give in back history, it can kind of just, you know, cause confusion, or people just get overloaded with information. And that's why I typically, if I'm ever like introducing the topic or trying to like discuss why I'm interested in what's going on or why I think the way that I do about it, I start with basically the Malaysia summit, and then Nawaf Al-Hazmi and Khalid Al-Mihdhar coming to San Diego.
The other thing that I do try to hammer home very early with people too is like to be out of the gate unequivocal that Al-Qaeda did 9/11. You know, like Bush did 9/11 and stuff like that is like a good catchphrase and a good way to like, you know, get people on the right track at least. But like, you know, there's such a clear history and such an important history of, you know, Al-Qaeda and Islamic fundamentalism that, you know, goes through. I mean, we did a whole great interview, Darren Harvey and I, about this. You know, the whole trail from 93 World Trade Center bombing to Bojinka to landmarks to Millennium, right up until 9/11, the East Africa embassy bombings, the Cole bombing. You know, you have all of this DNA, like, and all of this sort of structure that 9/11 is like built on top of. And like you have talked about in so many videos and in so many podcasts, Adam, you know, if you're not willing to even start from that frame, then like the story that you're left with is one that is boring, and I would probably never be wasting my time talking about otherwise. But like in order to have all of this context to justify why Al-Qaeda was doing what it was doing in the first place, you know, that's at least a year's worth of talking so far, and then we haven't even really gotten too deep into the Bush administration yet.
Right, and this is the reason why with 9/11, it's such a magnificent topic where you can basically branch out and have many tentacles in regards to foreign policy, the intelligence apparatuses, Middle East affairs, U.S. A relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia. These all come into play regarding not just with 9/11, but all the prior incidents that you just named. And why they're allowed to do this. And, you know, when people ask me, you know, what's the purpose of these radical fundamentalists? You know, do you really believe that they hate us for our freedoms? I say, no, in fact, quite the opposite. And I always use the example of Ramzi Youssef. And I say, well, all you have to do is just listen to him, because he basically was allowed to speak at his sentencing for his part in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, where he gave an hour statement to, I think it was Judge Nicholson, who presided over I'm Judge Nicholson or somebody else. I know he's a long-term judge. He's been around. He prosecuted a lot of the La Cosa Nostra members in the 80s and 70s. Anyway, he allowed Ramsey Youssef to read the statement and went for an hour. And at no point within that whole hour did he blame anything on Christians and Jews religiously.
Right.
It was mostly to do about American foreign policy and the history of American interventionism that goes back even decades. It's like they're telling you why they're doing it. They have no, they're not shy about showing, like not telling you why they're doing this, because you have many martyrdom videos that are basically made even from 9/11 perpetrators, about talking about U.S. foreign
Every
policy.
single one they caught, they didn't have to torture. Most of them were happy to sing like birds as soon as they were arrested. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
very
loved
much
talking.
so. Ramsey Youssef
Right.
was basically very gregarious.
Yeah.
He was, basically willing to, and that was the same with Abdul Hakim Arad when he was first. I mean, he was beaten up a little bit, but afterwards he basically, was given a hamburger and he talked about the whole Bujinka plot.
Yep.
But they're not shy about telling you why they're doing this in the first place, and it has nothing to do with women wearing short skirts or
Driving cars, yeah.
United States being
Yeah.
a Christian nation, everything to do with foreign policy.
Right.
And I figured that's where we should start. Is that
Mhm.
we should start from there. And so I'll basically start off by asking you that regarding the mid-history of Al Qaeda, what we saw in the build-up to Al Qaeda was basically that Al Qaeda came out of the Al Masada camp, which was an Arab camp based in Afghanistan. And bin Laden was allowed to do this because he got permission from an Afghan warlord during the Afghan-Soviet invasion to build it, because Arabs made up only about less than 10% of the fighting force. And they were only, the Afghans didn't like them. And they only considered using them because they were good enough to die in a battle that they needed to win. And so the Arabs themselves did not have a training camp. The Afghans allowed certain Arabs, like Juluddin Haqqani or Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, allowed Arabs to basically train with them. But there was no Arab camp until bin Laden got the permission from Abdul Rasul Sayyaf to build an Arab camp, which was called Al-Masada. And it was nicknamed from the English, the Lion's Den. And then from here, the core components of Al-Qaeda were built. And not to mention that, in James Corbett, 3-part series of Al-Qaeda and history thereof, he does give a great job of, maybe that some of the funding from CIA's Operation Cyclone had trickled down effect into bin Laden. But he does care to mention that Dr. Ahmed al-Zawahiri, who is basically from another Egyptian radical sect, Egyptian Islamic Jihad,
Rips.
basically came over to Afghanistan when they were all arrested from the Sadat assassination.
Right.
And that they intertwined with the Arabs in these camps and basically started growing. And so a lot of the members of the Maktab al-Kidmat, which was also built by bin Laden with the help of Abdul Azam and Abdullah Nas, that core structure that was built in Pakistan started building multiple buildings. And then we started seeing the connection into the United States when they built the Al-Qifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York, which was an extension of the Maktab al-Kidmat, which then we saw in Arizona, and then later Detroit, and then certain Southwest United States. And so we started seeing almost like this slow growth of this Arab fundamentalist sect that was probably fermented under the CIA's and the Pakistan ISI and the British MI6 with so much billions of dollars going into it. They don't know where this money is going.
Exactly.
And so there was a trickle-down effect, I believe, which that's built. And then when the war was over, all these fundamentalists, still fresh, battle fresh, they go back to their home countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Great Britain, United States, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever. However, what happens is the monster is already created, and now it's creating all these different sects that's Al-Qaeda affiliated, like Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines.
Yep.
Or Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia.
And it feels like we're seeing the same playbook now in Ukraine.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So now we started seeing an Al-Qaeda nexus in the United States. And from here, we see certain events in history, such as 1992 World Trade Center bombing, even though that was not Al-Qaeda connected, because they were still just being formulated in Sudan at the time.
Right.
But we see these radical fundamentalists from Afghanistan connected to 1993. And the FBI, after they arrest these people, basically say, well, there is no nexus. There is no, bigger growth to it. And my question to you, Ben and Eric, is that, boy, were they wrong.
Yeah, you can say that.
So, what have you learned from 1993 bombing onward regarding Arab fundamentalism and why it was allowed to grow inside the United States?
So I think for me, what I immediately think back to is not a dissimilar method of funding, method of sponsoring, method of kind of collecting extremist militia groups in Iran-Contra. And I mean, I guess I couldn't say if it's, how much it was, purposefully orchestrated to be that way. But it does seem like in Iran-Contra, I think we can pretty definitively say that Bill Casey was purposefully sponsoring militia groups for the purposes of creating a network of extremist militias that were going to be at the ready. And I think in her most recent book, Whitney Webb, I think that maybe she doesn't really drive home that the express purpose was creating rather specifically right-wing militias that were going to overthrow any democratically elected socialist government, particularly in the American South, or South America, I mean. But it does look a lot like the formation of fundamentalist groups that were militarized and starting to organize and become cohesive through the 93 World Trade Center bombing. So what I see from 93 is certainly, if not just a complete lack of history, then perhaps something like a purposeful ignorance. I don't know what you want to call it, but it does seem like, how did they not look at what happened through Iran-Contra and say, certainly the same thing is happening here, and that might blow up in our faces. I don't know if that made a lot of sense or if that's just my own wild ramblings, but
no, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, Ben, we've seen it through history before.
Yeah,
that the CIA is willing to work with these either ultra-Orthodox groups like Al-Qaeda or ultra-nationalist groups that we see in previous history regarding.
Well, I mean, go back to. Yeah, well, you can go even further back than that, Adam. I mean, look at post-World War II. I mean, there wasn't even a CIA at that point. It was the OSS. But you had folks like Allen Dulles and company. I mean, people always think of Operation Paperclip, as being 800 Nazi scientists, being whisked over to America, when in reality, you have your Otto Skorzenys and your Klaus Barbies and like some really heavy hitters and like, Nazi war machine, Nazi intelligence apparatus. And all of that just getting absorbed right as soon as the war was over. And, they couldn't immediately turn it on the Soviets. So instead, what you had to have was these series of proxy wars, that would go all throughout, shout out to Michael S. Judge again, but the whole idea that World War III already happened, and it was between 1945 and 1991 and fought in every country besides the United States and Russia, which I guess puts us now in World War IV, technically. You can argue about the numbering on that.
It's hard to keep track.
I mean, as far as to center this back though to the sort of Islamic fundamentalist like part of it, I think the other part of this worth talking about too is that all of this seemingly starts in the 90s, because in the early 90s is when the first American military bases end up in Saudi Arabia as part of Desert Storm, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I mean, there is a I don't want to start talking anything or give any kind of implication here that I think that Al-Qaeda is necessarily right about anything. But there is one clip, and I believe we've played it on our show too, Erik, of famed CIA lunatic Michael Scheuer giving his list of reasons. I think it was to Pat Leahy, of all people, giving his list of reasons why he thinks that Al-Qaeda, wants to attack America and has such a problem with America.
Right.
And, I remember us wanting to put that in because we thought it made him sound crazy at the time. But the more you think about it, like, how everything on his list is correct. For example, I believe his number one was our support of tyranny, the American support for tyranny throughout the Muslim world. There was our presence, like our military presence in the Holy Land. Our support for Israel was one of them. I'm drawing a blank on some of the other ones here, and we can get the clip afterwards for context. But I remember getting to a point where, like, when you actually look at like the material reasons behind these attacks, because as you mentioned earlier, it's not because my mother can drive a car or because women don't have to wear hijabs here, but it is these things that at the end of the day, like, we tend to be in full agreement on, PNAC and Al Qaeda in one way or another. Like, I think Eric and I agree that there should not be troops in Saudi Arabia. I don't think there should be troops anywhere in the Middle East or Africa for that matter.
Right.
Israel, like, again, stay tuned. That's going to be its whole. That's a very long story, but I think in general, like much like Michael Scheuer, if I could cut the Israelis off tomorrow and not give them another dime from our tax dollars, I'd be more than happy to do that. When you kind of realize where they're coming from, then like a lot of this seems to then like make a lot more sense, I would say. Eric, would you agree with that, or am I now like
no
have I booked myself a trip to Guantanamo now?
No, I definitely agree. That's kind of the wild thing, especially when you talk about the stuff that Michael Scheuer has said, is how much you realize that he's correct. He just has absolutely insane inferences from that knowledge
and no manners.
Yeah, no, good Lord, no manners. But no, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct.
So in other words, it wouldn't be too conspiratorial to basically say that in order to replace an old enemy such as the Soviets with their defeat in 1990, there would need to be a new enemy, and this new enemy conveniently is an ally that was created and partly created by the intelligence apparatuses, which is now coming back to haunt them because of their own malfeasance regarding how the United States perceives the world as some large chess piece, and picking out selective countries as being allies, and the most of the board is the enemy. Right. And most of the enemy is Arab countries. So
I'm pretty sure this is just the log line for Adam Curtis's "The Power of Nightmares." But
yes, and that's a great point to bring up, because that's a great series.
No, shouts out! He's got a new one out now that I haven't seen yet. But yeah, "Power of Nightmares," if anyone hasn't seen it, is a very good watch.
But
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Now we have a replacement enemy during the whole 1990s.
Yeah,
and this is how we could basically now talk about the intelligence apparatuses, mainly CIA, NSA, who are keeping very close quarters with these, entities that are now residing inside the United States. And so when Al Qaeda was being harbored by the Sudanese government under Omar al-Bashir, the president, and Hassan al-Turabi, who's the leader of the National Islamic Front, the group Al Qaeda, which was basically not a terrorist group to this point, basically is now growing at this point, allowed to grow in a country that is basically harboring these people. And at the same time, the NSA, at around this point, started listening to the satellite phones of Osama bin Laden, certain Al Qaeda leadership, like Mohammed Atef, military commander, Dr. Ahmed Oswiri, the second in command. And throughout the 1990s, the CIA and the NSA kept close contact with Al Qaeda, monitoring them at this point. And I mentioned this before, how the CIA would have these principals meetings with the Clinton administration about how to handle the issue of bin Laden. And there were some instances where they said, and this is coming from a CIA legendary operative named Billy Waugh, who was actually part of the capture of Carlos the Jackal, also in North Africa.
Hell yeah.
That Billy Waugh said, I was jogging past bin Laden, and I could basically kill him with a rock. And basically, they could just end this whole charade of, like, here's a guy that basically could pose as a threat. He's building training camps in Sudan. And the Clinton administration kept saying no. Meanwhile, the group gets bigger and bigger. 1996 comes along, 1998, 96, the first fatwa, which is against the military station in Mecca, Medina. 1998, now it expands to civilians. And so from here, Ben and Eric, we now see Al Qaeda, which has now moved into Afghanistan. Now is a regional threat, now an international threat, but completely ignored by the CIA, NSA, even though they're keeping close tabs with them, collecting so much metadata up to this point. Why not end just kill bin Laden why not just end the threat, but instead basically allow for this guy and his group to basically expand and become into a bigger threat, which basically now, up until this point, we finally see how much of a threat he is with the bombing of the East Africa embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. And so, even with that, what does the Clinton administration do? Well, we're not just going to kill bin Laden. We'll just send a missile over to Afghanistan and Sudan and bomb a pharmaceutical factory, which is the Al Shilta, I think, a pharmaceutical factory and a training camp where nobody was there.
Mm-hmm.
And so, why not kill?
Can I interrupt you, Adam, really quick? Not only did they launch do that cruise missile strike on Afghanistan and Sudan, I believe one of those cruise missiles at least also landed accidentally in Pakistan, which the Pakistanis were actually okay with, because if I recall correctly, I was just reading this like a few months ago, they were actually able to reverse engineer the cruise missiles that accidentally landed into their country, and that's how they wound up with ballistic missiles for the first time.
Yeah,
so
that's
something
right.
but happy accidents, I suppose.
It's like the Viet Cong with the Colt 911.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I had not known about the Pakistan ballistic missile.
Yeah, they apparently reverse engineered cruise missiles as a result of that attack.
Good. That's good to know. I had not known that. But we now have like this massive intelligence ring that is basically operating close by to bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And why not just basically eliminate the threat here? Why do you think that the Clinton administration basically denied every aspect of assassinating this guy when the warnings were coming in that, hey, there's a guy in Africa and Sudan who's building training camps who could be a threat, and this is coming from the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that they don't kill him?
I mean, I think you have to look at the history of what happened in that they did not kill them, and ask, going back to JFK and Mr. X, cui bono, who was benefiting from the permission to allow them to continue to operate, which undoubtedly that's what happened. And in that, I mean, I think there is a bit of speculation that has to take place, but then you start to get into a little bit of what James Corbett and Sybil Edmonds reported on in Gladio B, issues of Al Qaeda and Pakistan ISI and the CIA and the NSA and the FBI. In drug smuggling and nuclear arms smuggling. You get into Randy Glass, you get into Operation Diamondback. And I think that is what makes the most sense, is you have to have this continuation of these extremist militias that are going to be loyal to you to a degree. I mean, they're going to do what you want to do in order to obtain your geopolitical goals. And they are going to be continued to be funded by drugs the way that they always have been. It's just the same playbook pressed onto the Middle East in the 90s.
Plus, the Clinton administration was happy having those boys fight over in, Kosovo and Chechnya.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're still useful to them.
Right, because we were still fighting against Russia because that's how our economy survives.
No, true enough, and
it's almost all our economy is.
Yeah.
Horrifying as it is, they're still considered a useful tool because, as you say, we are fighting the communists in Chechnya, and then we did see a backlash from it because I believe Slobodan Milosevic began liquidating the Muslim population. There was this outcry. Why didn't the United States basically stop it? And that also fermented to a lot of hatred toward the West because we didn't basically stop the genocides that were happening in the Balkans. On top of this, because bin Laden basically does say in future interviews that was one of the reasons why they hated the United States upon, us stationed in Mecca, Medina, as you said, Ben, earlier, was that the slaughter of the Muslim populations by Milosevic's army was another reason why. And that in itself, and you wonder, people are wondering, well, how does that fit into 9/11? Because we also have a connection between the 9/11 hijackers in the Balkans at the same time, according to the intelligence apparatus, with Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who basically are engaging in the fight against the Soviets as well. 96 is a huge key period here because we see the formation of Alex Station, which was the CIA virtual station tracking bin Laden and Al Qaeda. Able Danger, which was the Defense Intelligence Agency's operation involving terrorist cells operating inside the United States. And at this point, we see the CIA come across, the NSA come across phone calls from bin Laden to a house in Yemen.
That's right.
The switchboard.
And basically, it was warranted enough to where, like, this phone number was quite important. It was red flagged by the NSA, and they wanted to know who was in this house. And it was owned by a person named Ahmed al-Hada, who was an associate of bin Laden from the Soviet-Afghan War.
Right.
And so the NSA builds a listening station. They start monitoring the phone calls out of this house.
Khalid Al-Midar's father-in-law too, I believe, right?
That's correct.
That's right.
He's married
That's
to
right.
the daughter Hoda al-Hada.
Yep.
And so now you have the CIA, the NSA, listening, monitoring these people, coming in inside the house and outside the house, wondering who these people are, tracking these people 5 years prior to the 9/11 attacks themselves. And you have an enormous awash of information coming from it. Even Michael Scheuer basically says that the NSA was the premier agency in collecting data intelligence. So, Ben and Eric, I would ask you here, how important was this Al Qaeda Yemen Hub Center, which is basically what it was nicknamed, the Al Qaeda Yemen Hub Center, in regards to the intelligence apparatuses monitoring these phone calls, monitoring these people's whereabouts, and you have this awash of information 5 years prior to the attacks? Would you consider this the most important epic before 9/11?
Maybe. I mean, I don't think that would be too extreme to say that it is the most important. For me, the thing about the Yemen hub is this is where you get into some of the nitty gritty, where you can really start to make arguments about what to believe in the he said, she said sort of stuff, particularly when you get into the Michael Scheuer arguments that the NSA had all of this, he calls, as you said, the NSA, this premier intelligence agency. And they were the ones that were preventing the CIA from being able to hear the full conversation. I believe like CIA was able to get one half of the conversation. NSA had both. CIA, what didn't they?
Michael Scheuer had to have a listening post built on Madagascar, so they could intercept the calls, and they could only get half the calls, and still had to go back to the NSA back address. And this is considered an intelligence failure. This is considered a failure of intelligence for this information to not be passed along.
Because the existence of this intelligence failure bolsters the argument for the entire basis of the wall argument, right?
Yes.
This is what bolsters the idea that, we have this issue of interagency information sharing. And this, I think, is kind of the nexus to where, for me, the argument really starts to break down, because George Tenet is the fucking DCI, which before 2005 means that he ran the NSA too. He wasn't just the head of the CIA, he ran the NSA too. Barbara McNamara should have been snapped in line by George Tenet if there was an issue with getting information and there was a legitimate concern over terrorism being planned and actually being able to be carried out, which didn't just happen in 98, didn't just happen in 93, continued in 2001. How the fuck did George Tenet not just tell the NSA to share the other half of the phone conversation? Go back and listen to his fucking 1997 confirmation hearings. David Boren is on the microphone talking about how important of a job the DCI is and how you need somebody like George Tenet because he is able to take responsibility and he is able to be the person who can answer all of the phone calls, who can actually rein all of the intelligence agencies in, because he doesn't just run the CIA, he answers to the president, he runs the fucking CIA, he runs the NSA, he runs everything, he runs the FBI. That was the role of DCI. That was the purpose of the fucking position that George Tenet had. So this idea that Michael Scheuer is just going to trot out this fucking, Barbara McNamara just told me to fuck off.
She wouldn't give me the other half of the calls.
Suck my dick, Michael Scheuer. Your boss could have told her to fucking tell you what was going on. That's why he was appointed by the president. Anyway.
Well, there you go. No,
well, they fired him instead. I mean, they didn't fire him. They offered him an early retirement that he did not take, and chose to pout in the CIA library instead. But Yeah, we should get him on the show sometime, man.
Yeah, that's right.
You know what's funny? Let me ask you, Bull. Why do you think there was such a huge wall between the NSA and CIA, even though, according to Scheuer, that they did have a connection inside the NSA's operations center regarding Yemen? Why was there such a hesitation in sharing information?
I mean, my personal opinion is that it allows plausible deniability for both agencies. You can conduct covert affairs that are technically illegal by U.S. law, and if there's this legal precedent saying that you can't share information between the two agencies for whatever reason, then you can conduct affairs and make sure that no one really, quote unquote, finds out.
I think these people are also insane. Like, I think by and large, this is an industry or a profession that self-selects just absolute paranoid like sociopaths.
Right.
And like all the petty bureaucratic infighting that we've joke about like every week, like the quote unquote screaming matches that aren't really screaming matches because they actually took place after the meetings that were supposed to be containing these screaming matches.
Right.
Like, these are all people that are just deeply weird and unpleasant and not sociable, and like just like it's not surprising. Like, I haven't heard a lot of Barbara McNamara. I don't know if there's even like a lot of public stuff like with her, but like just seeing Michael Scheuer's whole deal, like it's not surprising to me that like these kinds of things happen. Like it's not just necessarily that it's incompetence, but it's more of just that like these are how these people act, and like these people are all sickos and they're all freaks, and
Right,
like,
if they weren't, they wouldn't get the job.
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like cable news anchors in that way.
So we do have, so there seems to be a moral issue, a psychological issue, as well as an inadmissible refusal to share information where you happen to think it was, this could give you cover for plausible deniability if anything were to happen in the future. Well, it just so happens in 2 years' time, we have the embassy bombings, which, by the way, could have been, promptly prevented had.
Oh, let's talk about the coal bombing. I mean, not to get too far ahead there, but I mean, like,
well, I mean,
no one has ever asked the NSA, hey, what's up with the coal bombing? Like, why didn't you know about that? Like, why didn't that get stopped? I mean, that's been one of the most unbelievable things that we've been covering, like, over the last few kind of episodes in this El Hazmi Almadar arc. It's like, I don't understand the excuse here as to, like, how the NSA can justify that, like, they completely fucked it up on the coal bombing.
Right. And going back to your point about the East Africa embassy bombings of 1998, yeah, there were multiple opportunities to prevent that. In fact, James Risen in his book State of War talks about how there was a CIA source that told him, so I guess take that with whatever grain of salt you want to, that there were moves in May of 1998, so about 3 months prior to the embassy bombings, taken by Tenet to arrange a deal with Saudi Arabia in which Saudi Arabia would essentially extradite bin Laden. Essentially, their deal was that they would deal with the Taliban and they would extradite bin Laden to Saudi Arabia. And it would happen with, more so the moral support of the CIA and the U.S. government. But the goal here was to make sure that it happened and didn't upset any Islamic countries, because there was an issue of, particularly I believe Saudi Arabia, not wanting a Muslim to be extradited to the United States. And so there's the story that George Tenet struck a deal behind closed doors with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia agreed that they would take care of bin Laden if the CIA would back down, and the Clinton administration would also back down. And so George Tenet goes back to the CIA and he writes a memo to the Clinton administration and tells the White House that they are going to slow roll the pursuit of bin Laden. At this point, he tells Scheuer to go to the basement. And then 3 months later, the East Africa embassy bombings take place. And there's a story that Risen publishes in which Tenet goes to Scheuer and says, "We were wrong. We were wrong. We should have been pursuing bin Laden." And Scheuer goes, "With all due respect, sir, You were wrong. I was right.
Right.
But not only if you want to like talk about the CIA, you can talk about Mercy International and the FBI's investigation of Mercy International in East Africa prior to the embassy bombings, of which, for anyone who doesn't know, Mercy International was a charity front that the CIA and Saudi Arabia used to funnel money to Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan war. Those
Hey, Eric,
funds,
what bank did a lot of that money laundering?
I do believe the Riggs Bank did a lot
Nice.
of that laundering, which is fun for everybody. But Mercy International was this front that had a bunch of United States bases. Predominantly, I believe, their main United States base was in Detroit, Detroit metro area, probably Dearborn, if I had to guess.
Sounds right.
Which is the home to, I think, the second largest mosque in North America, Dearborn.
Big Muslim community there. I know that.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So they had contacts, Mercy International did, all throughout East Africa, including they also had contacts in, I think, Kosovo. They also had, obviously, contacts in Afghanistan. If you go back, you can read about how Ramzi Youssef's uncle, that was not Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's brother, was actually a senior executive in Mercy International. And when Ramzi Youssef went to Afghanistan while he was still a student in Wales, which is where he didn't really take place in much of the fighting because he was there at the very tail end of the Soviet-Afghan war. But he did receive training there. It's generally thought that he possibly learned how to make bombs while he was there. And anyway, Mercy International was being investigated by the FBI for ties to terrorism, and the CIA was blocking the FBI's investigation all the way up to August of 1998, at which point then the CIA was like, oh shit, and kind of backed down off of their blockading of the FBI and allowed the FBI to come in and sort of break up all of these terrorism groups, but none of it really got back around to placing any blame on the CIA.
We talk about motivation for these attacks, and they're all based on foreign policy guidelines of the United States. Now, right around the same period, we start hearing about where the formation of this new operation was to take place. And this was called the Plains Operation. And the idea initially seems to have come from a previous operation that was foiled, and that was just years prior to the embassy bombings attack, which is Bojinka.
Yeah.
And commonly known as Bojinka, in which was crafted by, at the time, Ramzi Youssef, the co-conspirator of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and his uncle, as you said, Eric, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who basically was both from Baluchistan, not part of Al-Qaeda at this point, and basically seemed to be rogue agents of fundamentalists worldwide that had their tentacles in Pakistan, in Indonesia, Philippines, Afghanistan. So the idea of using a plane as a weapon came from right around this period.
Right.
And if we're to believe the open reports, the public record, it is believed to be initiated by Abdul Hakim Murad, who is an associate of Ramzi Youssef's from Afghanistan, who was helping to build these Timex watches bombs in a hotel in the Philippines, and I forgot the name of the hotel. That kills me. I hate when I forget certain things. It was some hotel in the Philippines where they were building these
Was
very.
it the Ambassador Hotel? Does that?
No,
I'm
that
just pulling it on
wasn't
my
it.
ass. Never mind then.
I can't remember it. But they were building these Timex watches, in which the idea was to have all these Timex watches bombs underneath the plane seats where there was next to the fuselage, the fuel tanks, and then to have one plane, which was to be hijacked manually, and it was Abdul Hakim Murad because he was a pilot and he got his training inside the United States, and he would manually crash the plane into CIA Langley headquarters, and so this idea of using the planes as weapons basically was right around this period here, but the plan foiled for some, reason that they were mixing chemicals in the sink, and you had this black smoke coming out of the windows of the doors, unbelievably, they escape out of the hotel room, And Ramzi Youssef tells Abdul Hakim Murad, hey, go back and get the laptop. The plans were on there. And remarkably, with all the police and firemen there, he goes back and they see this guy running up the stairs. They all turn around and he sees them and he starts running the other way. He gets caught. It's just like something Ringling Brothers Circus.
I know.
Well, this is also around the time too that Ramzi Youssef, in doing a little bit of his own prep work, ends up blowing up that airliner taking off out of Cebu City in the Philippines.
That was part
too.
of the plot. That was,
That's
it
right.
was a test plot.
That was a test run, right?
Japanese airline 434, I think, was in.
I think that was it because it was a
They
flight.
didn't punch big enough of a hole.
Yeah.
They killed that one poor bastard on the plane, but then it wasn't enough to take the whole thing down.
Yeah, Ikegami was the guy that was killed. On
Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
Unbelievably,
it was a flight to Tokyo, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And I think it's debated, but like I've heard that the story was that like part of his body that got blown off wound up like keeping the cabin pressurized enough that they were able to land at.
Damn, that's some
heard
good
that.
detail.
Incredible.
Jesus.
But yes, but the idea was the idea worked that they could blow up these planes, and Hakim Murad, under intense pressure for weeks on end, basically spills the guts about Bojinka plot. Rodolfo Mendoza collects the information, gives it to the FBI, and what do you think the FBI does with it? Well, according to Rodolfo Mendoza, nothing.
Not much.
No stricter security measures at airports. So Erik and Ben, this idea of using planes as weapons, originating out of Bojinka plot, headed by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Ramzi Youssef. All this was known to the intelligence apparatuses in 1996. Ben, Erik, what am I missing here? Why?
Not only that, they were going to shoot the Pope in the Philippines too.
That's right. That was part of it.
They were going to get John Paul II in the Philippines.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, and I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
A Murad basically said that there was a hidden part to that plot that was not known, and that was that there were affiliates inside the United States waiting for a word to hijack 10 planes and to crash them all over intercontinental United States. And that's when Rodolfo Mendoza was appalled and sent the reports to the FBI. And basically, they did nothing.
Right.
So, Ben, Erik, I mean, what the heck? Why didn't the United States intelligence apparatus basically do something with this information?
I don't know. Somebody should have told Condoleezza Rice. My God. She had no idea that this was coming. Can you believe it?
Yeah.
Can you believe? Incredible stuff. I mean, either it's I don't know, Ben. I guess I'll let Ben go first. I feel like I've gone first a couple of times.
Yeah, I think it depends on who you're asking about. I think with the CIA versus the FBI, it might be a different story, to be honest with you. Like we talked about earlier, like one of the hardest things about this is coming with one central narrative or one central conspiracy because everyone's almost fucking up in their own unique way. With the FBI, like, I think there are some honest excuses that can be made. I think certain people, and I'm not speaking for the whole FBI here. Trust me, I'm not letting a lot of these guys off the hook. We have a lot of axes to grind, but I think that some of these people I think your Ken Williams and I think your Steve Bongarts and folks like that were trying to who was it, Erik, that we talked about the other week that literally said, as a warning, Zacharias Moussaoui is going to try to crash a plane into the World Trade Center. Was that Steve Bongard?
No, it wasn't Steve Bongard. Was it? What was his name?
Harry Samet.
No. It was Greg.
Jack Cloonan.
No, was it? Is it Greg Jones?
Greg Jones actually sounds right. Yeah, but there were these explicit warnings coming from these people that were aware of the Phoenix memo, and that had been chasing Zacharias Moussaoui around. They had this very real concern that these airplanes were going to be used as weapons, and it's something that we had to hear for years after 9/11 that to this day pisses me off every time the phrase comes up, and we make fun of it a lot on the show. Is this idea of intelligence failures, and failure of imagination is the one that Rumsfeld used to love to trot out back in the day. But this idea that we could never possibly conceive of planes being hijacked, and it's you have people in the FBI assigned to the Al Qaeda unit, throwing these warnings out, being hey, they're gonna hijack planes, hey, they're gonna crash planes into things. They should have known because they had broken the plot up prior. They had stopped this from happening. With Bojinka, and then it was stopped again with the Landmarks plot, and not the Millennium bombings were going to be more bombings, but they had broken these kinds of plots up before. It's not like any of this was new information or any kind of a surprise.
Right.
As to the CIA, CIA is like a more difficult thing for us. And, you know, getting towards the end of this whole disconnecting the dots arc that we've been doing now for the better part of like a year, it's ultimately hard for me to say almost like where the malfeasance is still coming from. Like, I still have a very hard time going back and forth between the idea that like they were protecting Al-Hazmi and Al-Madar, for example, because they thought they could flip these guys, or that they thought these guys could serve as some kind of like asset that made them worth protecting from the FBI. And then there's plenty of the rest of me that just feels like this is classic let it happen on purpose Pearl Harbor shit, where like
Right.
Tom Wilshire and Richard Blee and co were protecting these guys because they wanted something spectacular to happen in the United States, so everything else that followed could follow. And I think that the frustrating thing there is that we can only speculate to a certain degree. Like, you can use the material available, but like, even while we're concluding the story, like in the next episode that we're going to do, along with the last one that we did, it's almost a little bit of a black hole at the end, because you can point the finger as much as you want at Richard Blee, but like the motive is where things get difficult almost, because like either one would make sense. I'd be almost satisfied with either one, but like they each kind of have their own unique problems in a way. Like, we've talked a lot about the idea of Al-Hazmi and Al-Madar being Saudi agents, and like I have so many reservations and issues with that specifically, that like that to me, and like the whole idea of like the CIA and like this kind of triple, quadruple agent sort of nonsense.
Right.
It all seems way too complicated, especially for guys that like weren't that smart and didn't speak English.
Yeah, exactly. Especially that they didn't speak English. Yeah, I think that if you're going to try to break down and understand motivation, then you just sort of have to look at what happened. And we have the actual fact that the FBI knew that there were plans, you know, at least 5 years in advance to use planes as weapons. And after 9/11, the official narrative is that we could have never thought that this was going to happen. So you have either a systemic effort to block the sharing of that information, which is something that we see time and time again throughout events surrounding 9/11. You have this compartmentalization in all of these agencies that make it so it's possible to just stick somebody like Maggie Gillespie on, you know, a wild goose chase to do in her own free time. That's going to almost guarantee that they don't find anything that they shouldn't find, or, you know, are supposed to.
Or make sure that Richard Blee's boy Tom Wilshire conveniently ends up hired at the FBI as liaison, or job title that cannot seemingly be like consistently identified by anybody doing these investigations.
Or even like we've talked about, or we talked about on the episode that I still have to edit and put out. I'm sorry, Ben. In which we talk about what happened when Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar were eventually watch listed at the end of August 2001. Robert Fuller, who was an absolute green FBI agent that had like no business being the point man in this investigation, didn't even know how to like start the investigation. Didn't start the investigation until about 5 days after he was assigned to it. Like how is that possible with what Harry
not running
Samet
the most
had
basic credit checks, not running the most basic background checks,
and I mean, like, either because he was told not to, or what is very plausible to me, he just didn't really know how to do.
Yeah.
Because
which is why he got the job in the first place, probably.
Which is what we've seen. I mean, we see it with Margaret Gillespie. She didn't know to use the Hercules database system to search through these cables. She was looking through the wrong system for cables that Tom Wilshire already had pertaining to
which is the most important thing.
Travel of Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar.
We bring this up every 10 minutes, like every time we do these fucking episodes, but like, and it can't be stated enough that in all of this, regardless of what the specific example is, Tom Wilshire knew all of this since January of 2000. And like, it's so crazy making at times, because like, no matter how much benefit of the doubt you want to give him, it's like, well, dog, you knew about this for a year and a half. Why didn't you tell anybody?
I mean, if you're going to go in that route, Tom Wilshire probably knew in 1996 that the FBI had information about the Bojinka plot, because where was he at that point before he started at Alex Station? That's right, the FBI's radical fundamentalist unit. So
thanks
he
for
would
the
have known.
And let me jump forward to probably
Please.
one of my favorite topics of all, and probably yours at the same time, and that is a phone call that was captured by the NSA in late December of 1999 in which they overheard a phone call between Khalid, which is Wali bin Attash, and Khalid al-Mihdhar at the Yemen hub. They learned about this detailed meeting in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and the NSA basically tells the CIA and the FBI about this meeting in Malaysia in the hopes of them getting photographs collected by human intelligence that they would conduct. And what happens? Well, the CIA, through the Malaysian authorities, capture the photographs of certain people at this meeting. And what do, Ben and Eric? Well, they didn't share that information with anybody. And not only that, they also know that both men had U.S. visas. And the story of how they captured the photographs of the visas is one for debate. We can argue about that. But I'll fast forward to that the information that the CIA had, that they were coming to the United States, and that they had U.S. visas, and that they were both al-Qaeda subjects, well known to the CIA and the NSA for many years, that they were coming inside the United States. And what did they do, Ben and Eric? They didn't share the information with nobody at all.
That's right.
Not only that, but they subsequently say the biggest decision that comes out of that meeting is that, okay, we're going to keep following this al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi guy. Like, they both seem like they're up to no good. And then they immediately lose them when they go to Bangkok. Days later, we've checked this before. Like, Kuala Lumpur to Bangkok is not a long flight. It's 4 to 6 hours, I think, maybe. And when you go through and you try to pin down like the official CIA explanation for how they were able to lose these guys that they were supposed to follow to Bangkok, the explanation always seems to come up like, fuck you for asking. That's why. Like,
well, and also
it's such an unacceptable oversight that like,
I mean, it's not even an oversight because they, I mean, officially they lost them, but they didn't really lose them because they knew ahead of time that I believe bin Attash had called Bangkok and booked a hotel for the three of them.
Yep, they sure did.
And as soon as that happened, then Alex Station informed the Bangkok CIA station to collaborate with Thai officials and watch list the three gentlemen, bin Attash, al-Hazmi, and al-Mihdhar, which Bangkok officials did. And then CIA Bangkok Station waited about 3 weeks to ever follow up with it, even though they knew that they would be staying at this hotel because they monitored the reservations. They monitored the phone call in which bin Attash made a hotel reservation. So they took, I think, something like 2 to 3 weeks to even follow up with Thai officials. When they did, they heard, oh, yeah, actually, yep, we watch listed them. We had this information. Here you go. And then it took them almost another month before they shared that information back to Alex Station. And then you get the issue of this cable coming to Alex Station, in which George Tenet perjured himself in saying that nobody read that cable in the March timeframe.
We have the receipts.
But Dick Clark
stapled it more than once.
Dick Clark has gone on record, along with the CIA General Inspector in 2006 in the Zacharias Moussaoui trial. It is public record that 50 to 60 CIA agents read that cable when it came into Alex Station in March of 2000, which it got there 2 months late because the CIA made sure that it got there 2 months late. They purposefully dragged their feet. There's no other way of interpreting what happened there other than they purposefully dragged their feet.
And so with now Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi inside the United States, the CIA certainly by law cannot conduct operations inside the United States.
They sure can't.
Conveniently, the Saudis pick up from the CIA. And so they become the benefactors and the facilitators and assisters of Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi.
Now, sure seem that way.
Right. With the latest Operation Encore files that I've been reading.
Officially, they did, yeah.
The number of people that were involved is enormous. And there's a direct connection between levels of the Saudi government and the Saudi officials helping Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi.
Right. So
now, 1999, 2000 comes, you have other people coming from the west to the East Coast, and they were called the Hamburg Cell.
Yeah.
Muhammad Atta, Marwan al-Sheikh, Ziad Jarrah, and these are people who are coming from a mosque in Germany called Al-Quds, located in Hamburg, thus the Hamburg Cell. Right. And these are the people that are allegedly selected by Osama bin Laden as being the pilots for this planes operation that was purported by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to bin Laden in 1999, in which he wanted 10 planes, and they narrowed it down to 4. That's if we're going by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's words. take that
Right.
with a grain of salt.
Yeah,
now
because then you do have to consider whether or not they were going to use commercial planes or what do you call them?
crop dusters.
Crop dusters.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes,
Yes,
that's right.
Yeah.
Because Muhammad Atta does inquire about that. So now we have foreign intelligence rings, Ben and Eric. So the Saudis out west monitoring Al Midar and Al Hazmi in California. You have Israeli Israeli. So you have an art student ring, which is approximately 250, 300 people. And then you have this moving front companies. One, of course, everybody knows as Urban Moving Systems
Right.
in Florida, New Jersey, New York, where the Hamburg cells member lived at certain periods between 1999 and 2000. So you have the CIA, the NSA, the Israelis, the Saudis, all monitoring these members of what would be known as the planes operation.
I'm sure the Pakistanis had. I'm sure there were a few ISI guys in the mix too. The law of averages.
Sure. But Ben and Eric, all the while under the auspices of the State Department and the FBI.
Mhm.
So now, I of course, I'm going to be daring with this question for the both of you. Is it a stretch to basically say that they didn't tell them because they wanted to turn them as informants, or maybe, just maybe, they knew about this operation and that in order for this operation to be successful, they couldn't tell the FBI, and that they would take advantage after 9/11 to basically go to war with Iraq, Afghanistan, implement Patriot Act. Is that too much of a stretch to say?
Well, let's look back at what I had to say earlier about the structure of the role of DCI. Is there one person who can cohesively bring together all of these different agencies and be the utmost authority to them? I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, yes, that was exactly the goal, especially when you consider Tenet's history himself. I don't think a lot of people read enough about George Tenet's history before he became DCI rather. Before he became DCI, he had a very close relationship with George H.W. Bush. And it was a little bit contentious in some accountings of it that while he was DCI, or actually rather when he was on the NSC for Clinton, he was more loyal to HW than he was to Clinton. And that carried over as DCI. And it really does seem like the one person who had the authority to take care of all of this, all of these interagency intelligence failures, the one person who had the authority over everyone had the same foreign policy goals in mind that came about because 9/11 happened. I don't think it's a stretch, is my opinion. No,
and even without a smoking gun, I don't think it's a stretch to say that, like, regardless, the people that had to be ready after 9/11 with, like, what came after 9/11, they were ready to go. The Patriot Act, which no one has, I think, to this day ever read.
Right.
They had that ready to go within weeks. Continuity of government was switched on that morning, and you had your secret underground bunker full of your all Republican shadow cabinet that gets formed.
Yeah, which is my favorite, that there were Democrats upset about its existence, but only because they weren't included, not because
they found out from CNN, right?
Yeah, not because they weren't mad that it existed and that it was unconstitutional and that it was satanic. They were mad that they weren't included. I mean, yeah, and it all goes back to it all goes back to Dick Cheney too. Like he was there at
Contra Cowboys.
I know, yeah, exactly. Like Cheney and Rumsfeld, they were there at the very beginnings of everything that got switched on the morning of 9/11. It's very hard to look at all that and say Bush didn't do 9/11.
Next season 3 is going to be COG. I am such a freak for continuity of government stuff. It's not even funny.
Yeah, and this is exactly what we saw in the after effects of 9/11. But this is something that really just makes my gears drive and overdrive regarding this period of 9/11. And it just seems that all the warning flags were there, all the information was there. And according to even Thomas Drake, the former senior executive of the NSA, he basically does say in later interviews, and there's one where it's a famous clip from Fora TV where he basically says that one of the things about the NSA regarding all that metadata that they collected was that the NSA alone, had they shared that information, could have prevented 9/11 alone, just them alone.
Yep.
And it just makes you wonder the amount of information data that they had. Now, this is coming from even from people from Able Danger. I've interviewed Anthony Schaefer and Eric Kleinsmith, where they basically said that they collected so much metadata that they couldn't. Eric Kleinsmith basically told me once that he can only imagine what the NSA had, which was much bigger than Able Danger itself.
Right. Right.
Can you imagine all the information of the phone calls that they were listening to regarding Bin Laden's satellite phone between 1992 to 98 when he stopped?
Seems inconceivable that they
and
wouldn't
the
have
house
figured
in
something
Yemen
out.
from 96 to 2001. I'm one of the few people, but Paul Thompson is the only other ones, and yourselves, that bring this issue up. Wow, what did they listen to? What
Right.
could they possibly? Because when you have Al Qaeda people on the phone, they're not talking about the Yankees, and they're not talking about daily doldrums of MTV or something like that. So
They're not going to
these are
fucking
serious
Disneyland.
men talking
Yes.
about operations.
Yeah.
And so, Ben, Eric, I mean, you have so much pre-intelligence that could have stopped 9/11, and 9/11 was allowed to happen. And this leads into so much conspiracy. Like,
Right.
I can understand why, they were in on it. Could it be
Right.
explained such as that? Could it be easily explained as that? Or is there more nuance to it?
I think there is definitely more nuance to it, but that nuance doesn't. I think that nuance doesn't dismiss the malfeasance. I guess like the malignant nature of the core of the matter. That despite everything, despite all the nuance, I guess, it's still deeply evil what happened and what was allowed to happen and what was ignored for the sake of foreign policy goals, which at the end of the day is for what? For the national security interests. Our national security interests are like GDP. Like it's like our national security interests are just how much money we can make.
Our national security interests are keeping the war machine going at this point. Like,
yeah, it is deeply evil. So yes, I think there's definitely more nuance to it. It isn't just as easy as saying like, the Project for the New American Century, the Bush administration, whatever you want to say that it is, did 9/11. Yes, there is a ton more nuance to that. And I think that's what we spent the better part of a year really like dissecting, and what you do every episode of your show, Adam. But at the core of that nuance is deep fucking evil.
Would you agree with that, Ben? I mean, was that something?
Yeah. And I would say too that like I would say, and I think we've talked about this on our show too, that we as being, normal, plebeians, like we are held to a different legal standard than like the CIA is or the FBI is.
Right.
But like,
right.
I think it was Mark Rossini you had on your show once who mentioned, the idea of looking at 9/11 again, like a criminal investigation, like a series of murders and looking at it in that sense, not leaving some of the geopolitics aside and just starting with this factual basis. And we talked about this on the very first episode of the show. For me, if you know that someone is going to kill somebody, if you know someone's going to shoot someone with a gun and you have, a year to hide the gun from them or take the gun away or go to the cops and have them take the gun away and you don't do anything, and then one day that person gets shot, you're not directly responsible. Al Qaeda's more guilty than the CIA is necessarily, but at the end, it doesn't matter what the excuse is. Like, you still have that blood on your hands, and at the end of the day, no one lost their jobs, no one went to prison for any of this besides besides Kiriakou, but that was its whole other separate story.
Right.
But I mean, like, it's not good enough for me, and it's not good enough for the victims' families. Ultimately, like, that's why they're still fighting this out in court. If the kind of shit that the CIA has to answer for, they never had to. Tennant and Cofer Black and company like went and lied their asses off in 2 congressional hearings, and Tom Wilshire didn't even have to show his face to anybody. And a lot of these people, still work in the blob. Like, they end up getting promoted constantly because they're good employees.
Yeah, or they got like Spike Bowman and literally got a cash bonus. Like, insane. It's insane.
So, what comes after 9/11? We have 2 congressional inquiries, 9/11 Commission, and of course the Joint House inquiry. We have the FBI's Pent Bomb report. We had the CIA's Inspector General report, which showed that There was some malfeasance, but it wasn't totally their fault. Basically, all of these reports and congressional inquiries basically gave a very lethargic response and a lethargic report that basically I call them, especially for the 9/11 Commission, I don't call it an official report. I hate that term. I call it an incomplete one because there was so much information that they didn't put into the report that basically, and one of them was Able Danger, by the way.
Right.
But fast forward to all the years are passing by and people are just outraged and 9/11 truth movement is outraged. They want answers. Meanwhile, flooding them with them is the fringe aspects of conspiracy theories that basically awash and blanket the actual conspiracies of 9/11. Now to the present day of 2022. And finally, we're getting a trickle of information called Operation Encore. That is basically the follow-up, the FBI's follow-up to the Pent Bomb investigation of Saudi involvement to 9/11. And you would think that the media and other experts would jump on this latest revelations that are out there. And I've done a couple of videos on this, even a podcast in my previous podcast about it. Nothing. I mean, basically no attention is being paid to it. But it shows, and I said, if you want to get your foot in the door, well, here it is. And basically people are just slamming the door shut. I mean, Ben and Erik, what would be your response to how can we get the public's attention back to 9/11? So,
I mean, I think focusing on justice for the victims' families is the most important way of bringing attention to the issue. And I don't even mean to say that in kind of a I feel like I'm almost hesitant to put it in that way because it might feel like I'm almost using the leverage the leverage of the victims' families to bring attention to something that I just want to prove correctly. But I really do genuinely believe that they deserve better than to be mocked as Alex Jones adjacent for wanting more information to be released and wanting there to be answers to what happened to their loved ones. They deserve that.
Who were at the end of the day murdered.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, were not only murdered, but vaporized to the extent where people had to bury empty coffins or like a handbag in like a coffin. And if that was, we talked about this literally again on the first episode of our show, that if that was either one of my parents, I would not be satisfied with the explanation that had been given over the last 20 years.
Right.
While meanwhile, Saudi Arabia continues to be treated as, well, not anymore. And Adam, I think that might be worth mentioning too, as we're getting towards the end of this. So, I believe it was earlier this week now, the United States and the Biden administration has come out and said that they're officially going to take a step back and reevaluate the relationship with Saudi Arabia in light of the OPEC plus production cuts that came out. I believe that was last week now. And I mean, I think that's the other interesting angle in this, and that's because so many other things have happened that have kind of put 9/11 to bed in the public consciousness. It feels like we were told to never forget, but then Trump got elected, and then COVID happened, and then World War III or IV broke out, depending again on who you want to ask. And at this point, it is there are so many more urgent things. The economy is dying in real time at this point. There's about 4 or 5 more wars that could be breaking out at any given moment. But I mean, with Saudi Arabia back in the news again, I mean, maybe this is what finally gets us all to go green. Maybe we get off oil because 20 years later, we finally point the truth out and be like, hey, these guys are mostly responsible for 9/11.
Yeah. And I mean, even to build off of that, you have the very prescient argument that the world is the way that it is because of the way that 9/11 was allowed to happen. We got here because of that.
The state of emergency it's still in effect. I mean, it's been reauthorized by every president since W. And it's the same one from 9/14.
It's the same playbook being, played out in Eastern Europe right now.
Yeah,
it's the same.
It's
the same playbook that led
Eternal
to 9/11.
occurrence, baby.
Exactly. So if people finally want to grab a hold of history as it happens, then learning about what happened in the failures before 9/11 is a great way of understanding a very confusing world now. The difficulty therein is getting people to break out of their own bubbles so that they're actually interested in learning what they don't understand. Most people don't really, I mean, I think that's the same reason why so many people are attracted to fringe conspiracy theories about 9/11 is because it's hard fucking work to read all of this and actually do the thinking that allows you to comprehend these events, even in a surface way. It's difficult. it takes time, and people don't want to do that. They have shitty jobs and shitty lives, and they just want something that, like, like gives them a little like dose of like, I don't know, it scratches some itch, it lets them feel like they understand something, so they go to whatever you want to say, if it's nanothermite or whatever, no plane, what,
directed energy weapons.
Yeah, space beams, whatever it is. It is like, I do kind of hate that old adage of conspiracy theorists like are the way they are because they want an easier way of understanding things other than the hard truth. It's like that's kind of bullshit, but also it's not 100% wrong. Like, I think that people pick extreme theories, conspiracy fringe theories, because it is a little bit of a simpler way. That's much simpler than having to learn a ton of Arab names and understand the structure of the CIA before 2005 and memorize a bunch of like agents' names and read a bunch of memos and sort through a cache of 5,000 pages of documents. It is easier to just say, oh, well, there were no hijackers. I don't know. Israel loaded up the towers with nanothermite, and then just go about your day, continuing to
once
think
a year, spend 4 hours watching New Pearl Harbor, and that's so much fun that by the time you're done with that, I mean, who cares about any follow-up?
Yeah, but then you're just going to continue to dig yourself into a hole, and now you have to come up with a new conspiracy theory to understand what the fuck is going on in Ukraine. But I do think if you want like some kind of, I don't know if it's peace of mind or it's just going to make you lose more sleep. For me, I think I do get some kind of demented peace of mind from understanding the world that I live in that
I'm the
way.
same way. I'd rather at least know how the world works.
Right, but it is a way of analyzing history that allows you to understand current events a little bit better and not feel like you're just being played for a fool, I guess.
Let me ask a final question for you both. I want to hear 2 answers from this, Ben and Erik, if I can. What do you want out of your podcast? What is the future of your podcast, and what message do you want to bring to people in the future regarding any future works or projects that you may have or may not have in the works?
Ben, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing we want to instill in people is the idea that everything comes back to American foreign policy, I would say, at the end of the day. At least to me, I think that's one of the biggest messages, is that there's a concept, none of this happens in a vacuum. The engine of history never stops turning, and so much of the problems, I would say, especially in the Middle East, are all conscious policy decisions that we make here back at home, and a lot of ways we benefit from those. I mean, some of it we don't personally benefit from, but it's all something that we can make a choice to, and we can choose differently. And it's very frustrating to be, in the year 2022 and seeing the same playbook get applied to Ukraine. I can't imagine how low rent the Ukrainian 9/11 is going to be. They're going to end up, overhitting the White House by 5 miles, but
Jesus.
But no, honestly though, don't get mad at me for that. But honestly though, like, it is frustrating because, like, to see it so clearly, laid out, and to go through this story and realize that it's our support for Israel, and it's having military bases all around the world, and waging this constant war where as soon as we're out of Afghanistan, we now have to be sending all of our tax money to go fight the Russians now in Ukraine, and then. And I would say that if anything, our show is an anti-war show. I think I've been anti-war my entire life, and I think that if anything, it's just important to realize that it doesn't have to be this way.
Right.
I know at this point, given between unitary executive theory and Citizens United, it's not like there's a whole lot we can go out and do necessarily. You can't vote your way out of a lot of this shit, unfortunately.
No.
But if 1 or 2 other people can kind of hear this and maybe think about our place in the world and how we act in this world a little bit differently, then it's time well spent. And Erik's fun to hang out with. So
yeah, I would definitely agree with everything that Ben said. And I think for insofar as goals for the show, I mean, I don't really have goals for the show. I'm not like concerned about necessarily the growth.
There's always going to be another thread we can pull. There's not. I mean, we have a master list somewhere with like
we're-
20 different things we could do multiple episode arcs.
But I mean,
on, so.
you know, like yes, I do want people to listen to the show, but it's not like I want an audience. I want people to learn, and I want to learn myself, and I learn myself best by trying to comprehend something to the point where I can explain it to somebody else cohesively. And if I can help other people learn and understand the world that they live in and understand the way that our government functions, then I feel better about I guess my place in the world. But we're not doing this for money. We don't have a Patreon. We're not asking for anything. We don't care about our Twitter.
Do a Patreon. Give us money, and I'll do an Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah.
That's my other passion project.
If you give us money, we will strong arm Adam into starting a retro MMA show so that we can talk about that. So yeah, exactly. That's Ben's name for it. It's Pod Never Die. But we're not asking for money. You know, we're not trying to get a big audience. We don't want acclaim. We just want to help people better understand what the fuck is going on around them, what they see online every day, what they read in the news every day. If you read history, if you understand what happened in these kind of pivotal events, you can better understand what's going around every day, and it helps you feel a little less insane. And it helps me feel a little less insane to read about, which is maybe a catch-22 in, you know...
What's the old joke about Marxism-Leninism where the worst thing about it and the best thing about it is that you can see the future?
Yeah, exactly. It's
you see the future, but no one wants to hear it and finds you weird and off-putting when you talk about it.
Right. It does seem like a catch-22 to like spend so much of my life, or all of our lives, I guess, reading about something, as you said at the beginning of the show, Adam, so deeply depressing, but it does make you feel less insane in the flood of news that you're just inundated with every single fucking day when you just look anywhere. It's very easy to just feel so overwhelmed by everything that goes on and not understand what's going on. And like, what are you supposed to do? Like, turn on CNN and get a better understanding? Fuck that. So if I can help
if you have
anybody,
to live in prison, you at least be able to see the contours of the bars.
Yeah. If I can help anybody just feel a little less insane, or like feel like maybe they understand the world that they're living in and why it is the way the way that it is, rather, then I guess I feel better, and that's my goal, at least.
And it's not a huge audience, but when we first started doing this, I literally thought no one would ever listen to it in a million years. And the fact that there are people that do listen to it every week is still so fucking cool to me that
I know.
That's why I do it. Like, honestly, the fact that anyone listens is enough reason to keep doing it.
Right.
Ben and Erik, the podcast is the podcast for the new American century. Guys, thank you very much for coming on today. This is a great one.
Thank you,
Adam.
Like I said, this has been a long con, but mission accomplished.